Slavery. When we hear the word, most of us think of chains, cotton fields, and the crack of the whip. But slavery was more than forced labor, more than physical punishment. Behind the visible cruelty, there were hidden truths, truths so painful that even history books often avoided them. We know that enslaved women endured horrific sexual abuse at the hands of their white owners. But what is almost never discussed is that enslaved black men were also victims of sexual exploitation. This is one of the darkest, least spoken chapters of history. Today, on Black History Untold, we bring light to the silence, the unspoken history of sexual abuse suffered by enslaved black men. Historical context, 2 minutes. From the 17th century until the mid-19th century, millions of Africans were enslaved in America. Torn from their homelands, families were broken apart, and human beings were bought and sold like cattle. Enslaved men were forced into hard labor, working from sunrise to sunset in cotton fields, tobacco plantations, and sugar farms. But slavery was not just about work. It was a system built on total domination. The enslaved had no legal rights. Their bodies, their labor, even their children belonged not to them, but to the slaveholder. This complete lack of protection made them vulnerable not only to physical punishment, but also to sexual exploitation. When we think of sexual violence in slavery, the focus almost always falls on enslaved women. And yes, the suffering of enslaved women is immense and undeniable. But what about the men? What about the black fathers, brothers, and sons who also lived under constant threat? The exploitation, 3 minutes. The abuse of enslaved men is a story rarely told. Some white women, wives, daughters, and relatives of slaveholders, used their position of power to force enslaved men into sexual acts. Imagine the impossible position of an enslaved man. If he resisted, he risked being whipped, mutilated, or killed. If he complied, he lived with shame, fear, and silence. Either way, he had no choice. Slave owners viewed enslaved people as property. For some white women, forcing themselves on enslaved men was a way to exercise power over their property. Others used enslaved men for secret gratification, while society outwardly pretended women were too pure or innocent to commit such acts. The truth was buried. Letters and diaries from the time occasionally reveal these encounters. Some speak of men punished harshly for refusing a woman's advances. One story describes an enslaved man who was nearly whipped to death after resisting his master's wife. The silence of enslaved men was not a choice. It was survival. Speaking out could mean certain death. And even if the truth was told, who would have believed them? Why it remained untold, 1.5 minutes. This part of history remained hidden for several reasons. First, society was unwilling to imagine women as aggressors. The narrative of white womanhood was built on purity and victimhood, not violence. To admit that white women abused enslaved men would destroy that image. Second, racism itself silenced the truth. Black men were portrayed as hypersexual, dangerous, and uncontrollable. This stereotype served to justify violence against them, lynchings, segregation, and fear campaigns. To admit that they could be victims of sexual violence contradicted that racist myth. Historians like Thomas Foster and Deborah Gray White have studied this subject, uncovering fragments of the truth in diaries, court records, and oral testimonies. But even today, the abuse of enslaved men remains one of the least researched aspects of slavery. It is a history hidden in shadows. Impact, 1.5 minutes. The trauma of this abuse went far beyond the moment. It stripped black men of their dignity, their sense of manhood, and their ability to protect themselves. Imagine living every day under the threat of violence, stripped of your body, your voice, your right to say no. That pain does not end in one generation. Trauma passes down. Even after slavery ended, the myth of the hypersexual black male continued to haunt African Americans. White society portrayed black men as predators, when in reality they had been prey. These lies justified lynchings, segregation, and systemic oppression well into the 20th century. The scars of slavery's sexual violence are still felt today, in mistrust, in stereotypes, in silence. And unless we tell these stories honestly, the silence continues. Conclusion, 1 minute. This history is difficult to hear. It is not the story we are taught in schools. It forces us to see slavery not only as forced labor, but as a complete destruction of autonomy, dignity, and humanity. The sexual exploitation of enslaved black men is not about blame, it is about truth. It is about honoring the pain of those whose voices were stolen. On Black History Untold, we believe every story matters. Every truth deserves light, and every victim deserves remembrance. Slavery was a system of unimaginable cruelty. To fully understand its impact, we must acknowledge all of its horrors, including those that remained silent for too long. Because remembering is not just about the past. It is about justice, healing, and dignity for the future. Black History Untold. Stories the world forgot, but we remember.